So my name is Mercy from CLC, and I'm very glad to welcome you here today. The center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of the Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture series is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders and practitioners share best practices and also exchange ideas and experiences in building livable and sustainable cities. So in conjunction with today's lecture, we are having a launch of one of our newest books in the Urban System Studies series, titled The City of Culture, Planning for the Arts. And we are honored to have a diverse panel from various sectors joining us here today who have contributed significantly to the development of arts and culture in Singapore in their own ways. And the first speaker for today that we have is Mr. Michael Koh, fellow at CLC. He's had 25 years of experience in the public service, including 7 years as CEO of the National Heritage Board and 4 years concurrently as CEO of the National Gallery Singapore. He was also former director at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, where he spearheaded the planning and urban design of the mixed-use downtown at Marina Bay and the creation of an arts and entertainment district at Bras Basah Bugis. And he shared many interesting battle stories and experiences with us at the center, so I'm sure today is no exception with the crowd in this room. And our second speaker for today is Mr. Lee Ziyang, chairman of the Esplanade Co. Limited. He was founding chairman of the School of the Arts Singapore, SOTA in short, and was also chair of the Arts and Culture Strategic Review, the report of which was released in 2012, charting a vision for 2025 and reaffirming the value of arts and culture for our society and our city. He was an advisory board member of the Centre for Liveable Cities, and some of us at the Centre have had the privilege to interact with him in the course of our work. So do look forward to his presentation later as he shares with us the experiences and possibilities to make spaces for the arts successful. Our third speaker is Mr. Kenneth Kwok, Assistant Chief Executive of the National Arts Council. He oversees the Council's strategic planning and research, as well as community engagement and participation. Part of this involves establishing partnerships to activate more public spaces, such as those in the Civic District, for arts programming. And if any of you here were once from Anderson Secondary School or Raffles Institution and found him familiar, that's probably because he taught you English, literature, or drama, or tried to make sure you were a good, all-rounded student. So if you'd like to take your revenge on him, please feel free to do so later at the Q&A session. And our fourth and last speaker for today is Mr. Gaurav Kripalani, Director of the Singapore Repertory Theatre and Festival Director of the Singapore International Festival of Arts for the next 3 editions from 2018 to 2020. And he has produced over 100 plays during his 21 years with the theatre and was one of the first to champion the use of outdoor spaces for the arts in Singapore, having originated productions under the Shakespeare in the Park series. And I personally had the chance to catch last year's brilliant staging of Romeo and Juliet at Fort Canning Park. And witnessing the crowds there, I can personally say that Singapore's climate is not a good enough reason to deter people from watching a good show. So, for today's session, we'll start off with a short sharing by each panelist, followed by a panel discussion before we go into the question and answer session with the audience. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Suriani Suratman, Senior Lecturer at the Department of Malay Studies at the National University of Singapore, as well as board member of the National Heritage Board, National Gallery Singapore, and the National Parks Board. So, for everyone in the room, kindly hold all your questions until the Q&A sessions after we have all these interesting presentations coming up.
Very much, Mercy. Good afternoon, Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. I won't say too much. I think Mercy has covered quite a bit. But what I do want to say is, over the years, CLC, as part of our work, we've been documenting Singapore's urban development experience. So today's topic is something which is relatively new to us, looking at the social, cultural, and intangible aspects of the city. And as Mercy mentioned, today we'll be launching our urban system studies, the one on arts and cultural spaces. So do look forward to that. It'll be at the end and after the speakers have finished the panel session. So culture really is the DNA of a city. We talk about livability, and culture is very much a part of that. It's not just about the hardware, it's about the soul of the city. Culture defines us. So I hope in today we have an esteemed panel of speakers who I'm very looking forward to their sharing on their experiences in the arts and cultural sector. And I think without further ado, let's get right straight into it. So Michael, the floor is yours. The stage is yours, rather.
Hi there. Afternoon, and Thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you for our distinguished panel as well. Today, I'm going to talk about how we have planned and implemented a culture plan in Singapore, and illustrating through various examples. But firstly, why does culture matter for the city? I'd like to draw you back as an audience to what we call the Singapore Livability Framework. We all want the three key outcomes: high quality of life, competitive economy, sustainable environment. Yes, in the early days, we did not emphasize the arts and culture, but as we progress as a society, as we ensured that our people had jobs and homes, we were able also to then look actively at the arts and cultural scene. This is anchored on the systems of integrated master planning and development and dynamic urban governance. I think you'll find, and I hope that the key message from my presentation will show that culture and the arts in Singapore, in terms of space planning, have been guided through sound, integrated master planning, working across institutions, such as the NHB, NAC, and various ministries, as well as URA and the Ministry of National Development, to ensure a space provision standard for the arts and culture in Singapore. Why is culture important to us? Because it actually defines us as a people. It also defines us as a city, makes us distinctive. We have a unique multicultural, multi-ethnic arts and cultural scene, and it's something to be proud of, diverse and inclusive. A sense of rootedness and identity for our people is again a very, very important aspect of having an active and lively cultural arts scene, because it brings people together. Culture and the arts and spaces for culture and the arts are neutral bonding platforms. People of all ages, all walks of life come together to enjoy a performance, to share a memory. And together, that actually produces social resilience, because we have then shared in something that we have understood and will remember together. Now, how did we get to where we are today? Excuse me. This was where we began. Post-independence, we had colonial legacies like the National Museum, Victoria Theatre, and Concert Hall, and these were, I guess, the activity areas in the good old colonial days. Then when we gained, before independence, the Ministry of Culture was set up. We built the National Library in 1960, National Theatre in 1963. We progressed on to the Singapore Conference Hall and the Kreta Ayers People's Theatre in 1969. So these were the early facilities that happened. And this was when we were just beginning our journey as an independent country, as an independent people. These were the performance venues that I grew up personally with. Kallang Theatre, which began as a cinema but became a performing arts venue, and community centers were also activity zones whereby arts were actually, even in the early days of nation building, culture and arts were brought to the people. The Drama Center at Fort Canning Park, a building that now is gone as well. Of course, it sits under the National Museum extension. But more importantly, there were also auditoriums within commercial buildings, like the DBS building in Shenton Way and PUB building along Somerset Road. I don't know if any of you remember it, but there were lots of performances there. They were not ideal spaces, but certainly there were places for drama, for comedy, and for dance. Parallel to that, at the URA, there was also conservation efforts. I think the conservation plan was first revealed in 1988-89, and that actually also allowed us to bring new spaces to the fore, such as the substation on the right. It was an all-electrical substation, a conserved building, and what better use for it than as a building for the arts. The building on the left was an old school building. It was reused, and it was along, I think, Cecil Street. It's the Telok Ayer Performing Arts Center. It housed many artists, many groups, and it was actually a cultural hub. Office workers, after office hours, would actually go to this center to partake in a dance or a drama class or in an arts class. Then in 1986, the URA produced what we call the Central Area Structural Plan. This was where really true integrated master planning happened, because we were able to define where the commercial zones were, where the historic districts were, where the key open spaces were, and add on layers later on, as you can see from the next plan, where the civic and cultural district would be. So we defined this around the Bras-Basah Park area, which is where we are now, and also around the Padang. So even in those early days, 1988, 89, we already had these plans to define where the civic and cultural areas of Singapore, the pride and joy, would be. Then in 1989, the Advisory Council on Culture and Arts, I think this was chaired by Mr. Ong Teng Cheong, produced a blueprint for culture and the arts. It was a very systematic approach, and integrated with the efforts of planners, you have actually what we have today. The culture plan is actually a little-known plan. It was produced by the URA in 1991 as a layer plan of the Concept Plan 91. This was the first integrated strategic plan that the URA did without any UN help. 1971, it was done with the UNDP's help. 91, under the leadership of Dr. Liu Taiker, who was a CEO and chief planner there, we produced our first homegrown Concept Plan 91. Culture Master Plan was a layer plan. It took into account the constellation concept of distribution into regional centers and recommended also bringing some of the arts facilities, our libraries, etc., into the heartlands. And of course, nowadays, you see this happening before our very eyes. It also called for improving provision standards, and for that matter, at that point in time, we actually based it on the Glasgow standards, just for a good city that was rising, and it was a European cultural city of that year. And in so doing, we managed to safeguard many sites for arts and culture, together with the then MITA, Ministry of Information, Trade and the Arts, and also recommended in this instance having house museums as part of this plan. Cultivating key institutions, this was part of the Ong Teng Cheong report, was the formation of MITA, NAC, NHB. And in the early days, NHB actually had a CEO and 2 museums. There was no board, actually. So you can imagine how we started. It was that smaller growth, and look at how NHB has grown today into a 300-strong to 400-strong organization. There was much interagency coordination with other statutory boards, and STB, EDB, all collaborated across the board. Sound institutions working together, working as one government to actually bring forth the Arts and Culture Plan. Through the Conservation Plan and Preservation of Monuments Board, we managed to retain the old. So the Singapore Art Museum, the former St. Joseph's Institution, became the Museum for Fine Arts, for Contemporary Arts. The Asian Civilization Museum was also housed at an old school called the Tao Nan School at Armenian Street. That's Asian Civilization First Museum. And with the plan, we also created arts belts. The Singapore River, for example, was defined as an arts belt, and we tried to introduce cultural facilities there. We refined conservation guidelines, and Gaurav's home is there, SRT, because of this idea of Singapore River being an arts belt. Another home there is to another theatre group, who is right next door to Gaurav, actually. Okay, and through this, we hope to inject vibrancy and enable exchange, and bring the arts to where the commercial centers were. Kallang Theatre became host to many international venues, and then we came up with a museum DGP, Development Guide Plan, and created an institutional hub and green lung of the central area within this very zone that we are sitting in. We built the new, funding was obtained for the Esplanade Theatres by the Bay. There were 3 units. I think we could only afford 2 at that point in time. The third, I think Mr. Lee as chair is still fighting for. But we are building a small, medium-sized 550 theatre to accommodate the needs. But now that infrastructure was in place, that pride and joy of Singapore, the Esplanade Performing Arts Theatre, right? In addition, based on the plans, we also co-located arts users with community centres in the heartlands. The necessary stage at Marine Parade Community Centre was one of the first such integrated developments. So bringing arts and culture to the people right in Heartlands District. Singapore Wind Symphony at Ulu Pandan Community Centre in 2000 was yet another example. Then came the Renaissance City Plan, and this was actually spearheaded by Dr. Tan Chin Nam, who was then Permanent Secretary, and he led RCP1, RCP2, RCP3, and over the years there were different funding ideas for it. The first one was to strengthen Singapore as a global city for the arts. The second one was to build industry capabilities in art, design, and media, and the third one was over 5 years to make arts and culture an integral part of city living. So this funded a lot of the growth and the burgeoning of the arts and cultural scene in Singapore. So under the Renaissance City Plan, we forged economic and cultural links, we nurtured creative and cultural capital, and we also attracted talents to Singapore. Singapore was no longer a cultural desert. We were always accused in the early days, post-independence, we were a cultural desert. Today, I think Singapore is very eventful culturally. So I asked the EIU, why are we not ranked higher in culture? And that's because they said, well, you do very well, but censorship is one issue. So that's where we're not one of the top cities, because EIU considers censorship as a major issue. But yet, in spite of that, in spite of all this, we have managed to grow our cultural scene We have managed to work within frameworks and grow it, and our people now enjoy arts and culture as never before. Then we came up with the Bras Basah Bugis BBB plan. This actually instituted this area as Arts, Culture, Learning and Entertainment District for Singapore. We began in '89 to revitalize this area, and this area was actually awarded a ULI, Urban Land Institute, International Award for Excellence Asia Pacific for our efforts. But based on this plan, we're then able to go to the Ministry of Education and to art schools and say, locate here. And we injected the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, the LaSalle College of the Arts, School of the Arts, Singapore Management University, etc., in this very area. So trying to create a hub of youth, enthusiasm, and students within the cultural and civic district. The Asian Civilizations Museum moved to Empress Place in 2001 and freed up the Tao Nan School. Arts House opened in the Old Parliament. National Museum reopened in 2006. Peranakan Museum opened in 2008. And I was fortunate to be part of this, sharing with many colleagues here from NHB, as well as the opening of SAM. This was our Prime Minister's former secondary school at the Old Catholic High, and we converted it to partly an extension of the Singapore Art Museum for Contemporary Art. In addition to that, we actually managed to also grow our heritage centers. This was the vision of Minister George Yeo at that point in time, to establish links with other countries. Wan Qing Yan, or the Sun Yat-sen Nanyang Memorial Hall, is where Dr. Sun Yat-sen stayed during his many visits to Singapore, and where he lobbied local Singapore Chinese businessmen to contribute to the efforts of the independence movement in China. So it serves as a reminder that we, Singaporeans and Chinese businessmen at that point in time, contributed to the independence efforts in China, a small part by a small country. The Malay Heritage Center, another very important center, serves to remind us of the cultural roots of the Kampung Glam historic area. Kampung Glam was actually, I believe, the printing capital for Singapore, for the Southeast Asian world, actually. And the Indian Heritage Center, the latest in this, which I was also fortunate to be involved in, just opened recently, and it showcases the culture of our Indian fellow citizens in Singapore. National Gallery opened, and this was a big battle because originally the City Hall was freed. Various agencies said, what a great office it would be for us. And then there was a thought that, hey, maybe we should open that to a hotel. But all these would have privatized this building. So in the end, when the Supreme Court also became available, the planners said, how about creating a beautiful institutional space? And that was when the idea of the National Gallery grew, and it was born, and that was where these two buildings have become what it is today, the National Gallery of Singapore, allowing free, unimpeded access to the public rooms of the building, to which none of us could ever had access before. And if it had been a hotel or an agency office, we could have not gone in as well. So now, public areas, public facilities in these two buildings. And the injection of F&B retail, something that what I'd like to claim responsibility for, because we originally had, the architect had a sculptural gallery on top. I said, why do you put the heaviest things on top of the roof and create a great cost to us? Let's have F&B and overlook Marina Bay and the Padang and enjoy the view. And today I'm glad to say that these are very popular venues. Aura, Smoke and Mirrors, and lots of weddings are held there. So if you haven't been there, do go to these restaurants. There's also a free viewing gallery because we made sure there's also an area that you don't have to pay for and you could go in for free. The Art Science Museum, this was a different aspect because we managed to put it as part of a requirement in the tender for the Marina Bay Sands Integrated Resort. And it came about, and it was part of the necklace attractions around Marina Bay that will complement the Esplanade theatres by the bay. The third bead in the necklace at the Promontory site is still on my wish list. I hope we can build a contemporary arts center there in future. The hardware now, as you can see, is all in place. Together, we have small, medium, and large performing facilities. We have museums, we have artist housing, we have arts housing in conservation districts. And now, the software part is coming in. The place management, the programming, the annual events such as NAC, Writers' Festival, Art Stage Singapore, the links with the world, cultural diplomacy, and shared heritage. And it was because of Minister George Yeo's vision that we signed the Memorandum of Understanding with the French. And that resulted in a lot of cultural exchange with France. And this, the Arts and Cultural Strategic Review, which I was very fortunate to co-chair one of the subcommittees with Mr. Lee Zun Yang, was great fun because, we had fun because we kept adding things to that report. The ministry was saying, wow, stop. Then we said, no, more. And we produced as a subcommittee, if I recall, Zuya, the thickest report of the whole lot. We were unashamed, and we just said, let's go for it. And I'm glad that a lot of it has been incorporated, and I'm so happy to see the funding was made available for a lot of the initiatives that both Zuyang and myself championed for. The Yore Master Plan looked for a relook at the Civic and Cultural District version 2.0. We looked at placemaking, we have Night Festival, we have Cultural Festival, Heritage Festival, which one of my colleagues, Tangam there, was responsible for starting. Streets as public spaces. NGOs are now closing the streets for activities. How wonderful. We are coming up as community-driven, grounds-up arts activities. All the revamps that happened, ACF, National Gallery, and more importantly, more community outreach. Our museum at Taman Jurong was one of our first forays into the heartlands. Our Tampines Hub incorporates not only a museum, but a library within sports facilities and shopping right in the commercial regional center. Please do visit because it's an amazing building. And bringing arts and culture has gone way beyond the city center into the heartlands where we all live. Now, in closing, my wish list, personal wish list, let's have a contemporary arts center. Let's boldly put it on the central promontory at Marina Bay. Could we have a National Trust for Heritage Homes? Have any of you been into a black and white bungalow to visit? I know they rented for $20,000, but certainly I would like to visit one or two and see it, in full historical splendor. And I would say more small to mid-sized venues, and we're talking about that just now, 500, 1,000 seaters. And another dream of mine is to have a center of mixed cultures, or mestizo culture in the car park space next to Peranakan Museum, anchored in the Straits Chinese culture that we contribute to the world and discourse. Thank you.
I actually have more slides, so I don't really want to jump into the slides yet, probably too many slides. Thanks, Michael, for setting the scene. He's actually taken us through the whole history of sort of government thinking on the arts. So I want to do something different, which is, before I show lots and lots of nice pictures, and the pictures will all be based on my experience with SOTA, School of the Arts, and the Esplanade, and how spaces can be activated. I want to just caution that although today is all about spaces, spaces are not the answer to everything. And I think NAC and I hope the government gets that as well, which is that, what would make a space successful for arts and culture? You could say content, but imagine if all that content was just chucked into the space. Would it succeed? Only by chance, right? So really what we need is curation. You need a whole mid-office and back office to work with the artists so that audiences can appreciate their work. And that's where I'm going to spend a bit of time just talking about that before I show you all these nice pictures. So curation, I think, takes many forms. At a very basic level, it's presenting an artist or art form in a way that would best attract that audience to understand the work, sometimes to understand the artist personally, to appreciate, to raise relevant questions as to the motivation, the context, the history of that art. We also can look at it at a festival level, which is, developing a theme, managing the expectations of the audience, building a brand for the festival, something which I'm sure Gaurav is thinking about. Not just to attract the audience, but also to attract performers and artists to come and join your festival. And the festival is often across different spaces. Examples of very successful, well-known festivals are Edinburgh, arguably the Fringe, which is even more well-regarded now perhaps than the main one, Venice, the other Biennales, and of course our own CIFAS. But there's also curation of a space. And I think there are close parallels here to traditional retail. I hope there are some retailers here, although I doubt it. But you want your audience to visit your site. You want to build a brand so that people look to satisfy or indulge their expectations. You want to surprise them, astonish them without necessarily shocking them. And you try to build repeat business so that they'll come back to your space. And the only way you do that is you have to deliver to or exceeding the expectations of the experience. And like retail, location matters greatly when you look at venues for arts and culture. So traffic, convenience, proximity to housing, to public transport, other amenities, all these do matter. And like retail, full use of the space is very desirable. You don't want to leave anything unused. There's a need to obtain value from that space. You really want to make sure that the equipment and facilities are fully exploited. So things like sound, lighting, and so on. These require professional skills and experience to achieve the objectives of the artist. Right? If you talk about branding of spaces, we have some examples in Singapore. I think if you look at Substation, for example, it has built a brand around, perhaps you would call it social commentary. MBS, Marina Bay Sands, has built it around entertainment. VCH, Victoria Concert Hall, perhaps around Western classical music with the SSO resident there. At the Esplanade, we often joke that we're looking to build our brand around a fruit, the durian. And why do we call this our emblem? Because we want to represent a certain richness of experience, sort of unique pride and affiliation to this, because it's very local, but perhaps also to acknowledge that not everyone will like us all the time. So I think spaces are only successful if they are curated, and they're curated to an extent, not necessarily fully curated. They develop an identity, they encourage the audience and the artist to identify with it. Now, venues for hire, I think, are also important, but they will not be as unique in identity. There may be multiple users for such spaces, such as corporate events, weddings, and so on. Experience, I think, our experience certainly shows that successful curation results in higher utilization than pure for hire venues, because of the active management and the ability to attract. So Esplanade, in the Esplanade, our direction is moving towards more and more curation. We want to do more Esplanade Presents kind of shows rather than just hire out the halls. I think we still have a mixed model of hire and our own shows, but as we move towards more and more own shows, we find that our utilization improves. So I think from a public policy perspective, it makes sense not just to look at building and providing physical space, but also at placemaking, at investing in content, in curation for the arts and culture. So Michael referred to the fact that he and I worked on the ACSR, the Arts and Culture Strategy Review. That did not just look at building new spaces, but at activating available spaces with potential. And these could be fitted out, physically managed, curated, made available. Schools, institutions of higher learning, these are prime candidates, just as they are for sharing their sports facilities with the public. Their performance spaces can also be made available to the public if their concerns about security and so on are addressed. The idea of clustering, which was already used in schools for other resources, equally applies, I think, to arts and culture. I think other public spaces are also only limited by the imagination of the managers of the spaces and the availability of good curators who can, aware of the possibilities, can help to present in the space. So purpose-built is good, but expensive. I think we should explore a range of facilities without having to build everything new. Investment should be not only in bricks and mortar, not even in just equipment and facilities, but in the people who are going to make this happen. And the people who are going to make this happen are not only artists. In an economic and job sense, I think there's a scope, huge scope, for a range of skills, experience, interests to make arts and culture spaces flourish. But the business and employment models for such work are still very variable. Their characteristics often make them less desirable. It's in the nature of such work that they are very flexible, they're very project-oriented, So continuity is a challenge. Development of professionalism and domain knowledge has a challenge. It's really non-traditional employment, like the gig economy. And I think this requires more recognition in Singapore in both legal and institutional terms, because the weaker suffer. They're often taken advantage of. This is not unique to Singapore. It's often in many other countries. But I think in Singapore, we are perhaps starting from a more regulated, conventional employment kind of model. And I think society is generally less sympathetic to the issues that affect people who work in such jobs. Let me now move to some of the nice pictures that I promised you about. SOTA was designed and actually built to share its top performance spaces with the public. So it was built with external segregated access. You can see up top left, the concert hall, top right, my personal favorite, the drama theater. It's a nice warm space. Then the studio and the gallery, which is for visual arts. It does not curate external works, but it has a very full internal program of shows. So it manages this sharing by giving first crack to its own faculty, who have to say the dates that they need 18 months ahead. So this year, they have to plan for next year. And 12 months ahead, it opens to the public. So utilization of its spaces is currently running at around 60%, 60, of which about 35% is used by the school, 65% by external. It does partner arts groups who regularly perform there. Together with its own shows, I think it has developed a good position, branding as an arts venue. And I think it's also worked to activate its non-specific spaces. So I'll show you some of them. So this is the performing and visual arts venues. These are the partners which they brought in. So the Singapore Youth Festival regularly goes there. THE Dance Company, the Human Experience. Singapore Chinese Orchestra. Orchestra of Music Makers. In fact, I think OMM, in that space, that's actually inside the school, is actually on the 5th floor. And in the gallery, the visual arts students have done a very interesting project with the old residents in Whampoa, which is a very historic area with a lot of very senior residents. And it basically allowed them to learn about the history of the area, the history of the people, and they turned a lot of that understanding into visual work, which they exhibited in the gallery as part of one of their projects. And when they actually opened, they actually brought the residents back in, and the residents had a really good time. So these are some of the spaces around SOTA. The East Plaza, which is the one that faces Seligi side, you can see before they started working, it was a deliberate attempt to try and make it more attractive. The level 1, which now actually has got shops and food as well. Level 2 upstairs, also with some shops and food, but also with a lot more visuals. And probably the part which is most prominent, which is the part that actually faces Dhoby Ghaut, the main steps that come down. This you can see it before, after, and then how it is now being used. So the National Reading Movement had an event there. You had a music and drum event there. And then, of course, you had the night festival. And it's been a part of the night festival for a few years. I think this year, the night festival actually did not incorporate them, but the school had a celebration anyway during the night festival. And people came. So you can see, it's not about just painting nice stickers onto the steps. Yeah? It's about people who know how to bring the crowds in and how to encourage activity. Also on the ground floor, or level 1, they have a makers parade. And they have future plans. They have ideas as to how they will use their public spaces, either for craft markets, for festive arts, and for public performances. So I think they're really thinking ahead. They're also engaged in other venues. So they reached out and they're participating in things at the NLB, National Library Board. They're also at this here, at the National Museum, Masak, and also at the Art Ground. The Art Ground actually is, for those of you who don't know, it's at the Goodman Road, near to the NAC. It's actually where SOTA started. The first premises of SOTA, before they built the brand new premises, was actually at 90 Goodman Road. Let me now turn to Esplanade. This was built with 4 performance spaces, 2,000 and 1,600 seat theatre and concert hall, and then a 220 seat studio and recital studio, and one slender visual art space called the Jendela. The original plans, and Michael referred to this, included actually 2 mid-sized theatres, and these were not built. I think at the time, there was considerable worry as to whether the Esplanade as a project would succeed, meaning would it actually get an audience. It was never tried before in Singapore, so I think there was a lot of apprehension as to whether they wanted to go ahead. But in retrospect now, we really regret, I think, that it was not built, because it's very hard now to retrofit. It would cause tremendous disruption. Actually, in the ACSR, we made a recommendation that we should complete the Esplanade, the parts that were not built. But I think due to national priorities, we've not been given the funds. But at the board level, we said we will go ahead anyway, not to complete the plan because that is too expensive for us to stomach. But we found a little plot of land next to the waterfront. And we're going to try and build what we call a temporary mid-sized theatre for about 550 seats. The concert hall and theatre are the best known. Probably the best, other one that is most iconic in terms of structure is the outdoor theatre. This actually was so successful that within the first 5 years, we had to extend it because it was too small for the audience that was coming for the outdoor theatre. The annex studio, now there's a story behind this. Those of you who know Makan Sutra, the hawker stalls, there's a little annex next to Makan Sutra which is full of F&B. In the old days, there used to be a pub and a nightclub there, which at one time was even run by, I think, by NTUC. We had so many problems with that club because of discipline issues, police are being called, fights and so on. In the end, we terminated the contract, and we turned it actually into a, it keeps skipping on its own. We turned it into an annex studio, which is actually now a place where I think new artists can emerge, where we are creating possibilities for less known groups to come in and actually be discovered. We're very proud of the way that we've used the concourses. The concourses, as you know, were just built to connect the two, the theatre, the concert hall, and the shopping mall. But in fact, the upper concourse has certain possibilities. You can see this. It's got huge sort of spaces, and actually it's got walls as well. It's got tremendous light. So we've actually been able to put a lot of performances into the upper concourse against some very spectacular backdrops. The lower concourse, you may be able to see some steps there. There's actually a ramp that goes up. I don't know what they were thinking, but the original plan was that those ramps were going to be for disabled. It was going to allow the disabled to ascend from the lower concourse to the upper concourse. Actually, if you look at it, the width of those ramps are very narrow. I would not let anybody go up there in a wheelchair. So we decided to convert those ramps into a visual art space. And actually, we've now done various things there, some successful and some, I have to admit, less successful. But anyway, we've used the space. So there's a general idea that we will not leave any space untouched. Even the tunnel, there's a tunnel that connects the MRT to Esplanade. This is actually an MRT tunnel, but we have got the MRT to allow us to curate the tunnel, and for the last few years, we've been actually putting artwork there. If you go there today, you will find that there's a series of artworks up there for online auction. We worked with some 200 local artists since we've started the Esplanade, and some 38 of them have donated their works, actually, for this, what we call 80 by 80. They're all in size 80 by 80 centimeters. And the artwork is there for you to online bid to acquire, and the proceeds will then come to the Esplanade for our community programs and so on. So we are very, very grateful to the visual artists for this support. Within the Esplanade, there's a theatre street. You can probably see in the connections there are some big openings to the sky if you walk along between the various F&Bs. So there's actually tremendous ability, possibilities there for activation of that space. Pip's Playbox was something we discovered, a new space right on top. So we opened that up and we converted part of the roof as well, near Orgo, near the other F&B bar. And this has become a children's playground. And Pip was the character that we invented to be the mascot for this. And we actually run kids' classes there. The forecourt garden, I wanted to show you it in its most serene form and then in its most active form. It's possible to move from this, which is a nice fountain and quite languid and placid, to really active, depending on what kind of activities you're thinking about. And of course, we have a whole series. I think we have 14 festivals during the year at the Esplanade. Quite a few of them are tied to cultural celebrations. So we've got Pesta Raya, we've got Hawaii, and so on. And we've also have things like the Dance Festival, the Mosaic Festival, which used to be a festival. It used to be all together in the same period. But actually, we've now spread it out, and we now call it a series because it has its own brand. And of course, when we have a festival, it takes in all the spaces within the center. We also have a community engagement program. So not many people perhaps realize that we're actually a charity. We're an institution of public character. And we actually work a lot with the underserved and the disadvantaged. Arts and culture has been shown to have very positive effects in therapy, both for those who are ill, for seniors, for troubled teenagers, and so on. And in fact, this is in our portfolio of activities actually the fastest growing area in the portfolio, and it all needs to be funded. So I think in summary, I think we continue to develop our own curatorial team. We have a curatorial team at the Esplanade of about 45, all very young. I tell young people that if you're interested in the arts and you don't want to be an artist, then you should come and join the Esplanade, because you, at a relatively young age, you will be exposed to some of the best artists and art forms that you can find in Singapore and internationally. We also train technical theatre skills. So we run courses all the way up to MOM certified for sound technicians, for stage, people who can run technical theatre. And we train about 250 a year. And these all, we get our pick, of course, to employ those who we like, but they all emerge into the environment in order to man the venues and so on that we would like to have in the wider, because there's no point opening venues if you don't have people who can run the sound and the lights and so on. So in summary, I think purpose-built, fully equipped venues are important, because only then will we attract and challenge for the best performers to present their work. Only then can we show the full possibilities to our artists and the audience to whet their appetites and their aspirations. But there are also many spaces and many ways to activate them. So opportunities for, I think, managers and curators to work with artists, to show their work, to use these spaces, to bring in audience, to bring in traffic, to engage the community. And this is what I see as needed to make spaces for arts and culture succeed in a sustainable way. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I think Michael gave us a very comprehensive presentation that took us through the decades of Singapore's arts and culture scene and how it intersects with urban planning, city design, city living. What I hope to do is to kind of extend from there. So some of the themes may be quite resonant, But I think also for what I hope you'll be able to see, what are some of the concerns that the National Arts Council has had over the years and how we try to address some of these issues in partnership with the artist community in Singapore. So a very simple way of looking at some of the space issues in Singapore when it comes to the arts community. We start off by looking at the artist side of things and, very straightforward. Immediately you think, what are the spaces available to artists to present their work? Whether it's an exhibition, whether it's a dance performance, whether it's a theater performance. So presentation spaces, definitely one key component. But of course, the other part is the space for all the rehearsals, the incubation work, the office work that comes as part of that, the rehearsals. So those are the two things that we immediately think of when we think about art spaces in Singapore. But I think we need to look at the other side, not just the supply side of arts creation, but also the demand side, the receiving end of things. How do we bring the arts to more people? And that's where we look at perhaps the public side, where we talk about increasing access to the arts. How do we help to bring the arts to more people so that the arts can become an integral and an integrated part of everyday life? So linked to this is not just the demand from people, from audiences, but perhaps also the demand of what we can do with spaces. There's a demand for spaces which perhaps have not utilized their full potential. How can the arts come in to increase vibrancy, to energize those spaces or activate those spaces so that their full potential can be unlocked for a wider, for more opportunities for good living for everyone? And I think what's also very important is to look at the space in between. Because of course, artists are members of public are artistic, are creative as well. So this whole ecosystem is really what I hope to walk through with us today. Really this whole idea that artists need space to create and to present their work, that we hope that more people can benefit from the arts and understand the true value of the arts. And finally, through this integration and coming together of both sides, really how we can then develop more audiences, supporters, and patrons for the arts. I think, as Mr. Lee said, it's not just about spaces for the sake of spaces. Ultimately, it's about the people, it's about the program, it's about how it transforms the way we live, the way we think, the way we are as people. So I'll start off by talking about presentation spaces, and I can probably go through this very quickly because I think Mr. Lee has given us a very good and very detailed insight into life at the Esplanade, right? So definitely in terms of presentation spaces in Singapore now, we have really world-class facilities. I mean, the Esplanade, for example, is very well regarded. Its concert hall is recognized internationally. We also have the National Gallery, for example. And for me, these are important for society, not just because they are presentation spaces, but they are iconic spaces. They are spaces all of us as Singaporeans are proud of. If you jump into a cab and you say, take me to National Gallery, take me to the Esplanade, they will know where to go. So that idea of national pride, of civic identity is a very important part of the creation and establishment of such iconic spaces. But of course, we can't have an endless string of such high-end performance spaces. And so it's also very important that we have presentation spaces that cater more to a mid-tier crowd, all right? So mid-tier arts venues that perhaps can go into community spaces. So if you go, for example, this picture here is of our Tampines Hub, which was recently launched. So there's a festival theater in our Tampines Hub. Is the level of acoustics and the rigging and the lighting at the level of the Esplanade? Of course it's not. But it is of a very high quality nonetheless. So it's creating more options, and one of the things that the panelists talked about over tea just now was the fact that our art scene has evolved and matured so much over the years. There's so much diversity. We need to build this diversity into what we are providing our artist community. And so there's the idea there that we need to work with various partners. In this case, one example, the People's Association, to really unlock more spaces, create more platforms, where you don't just have the very high end, you also have very mid-tier spaces that offer very good quality performances, productions. Hopefully you encourage more people to then also move to your Esplanade, your National Gallery, etc. But the third one that's of course then also very important in terms of presentation spaces is really sometimes you just want presentation spaces that are right at your doorstep. And so one of the things that National Arts Council tries to do is we've launched a series of programs called Arts in Your Neighborhood, where we literally go to community spaces right at the HDB flats, open spaces in community centers and community spaces, and really just bring the arts to the people right there and then. And we have partnered with a lot of different agencies, such as libraries, to bring this diversity to the general public. So that's the presentation spaces part of things. The next part I want to look at is arts housing. And we talked about how artists don't just need presentation spaces, they also need spaces where they can rehearse and do administrative work, incubate their work, etc. So one of the things that the National Arts Council has done is, of course, to provide arts housing. So in a very literal sense, artists need spaces. The National Arts Council provides subsidies for rental, fees, etc. And one example is Telok Kurau Art Studio, where artists have such spaces. And that's one model. But I think we need to really look at how, as I said earlier, the arts can go beyond to reach out to more people. And that's why we are also exploring arts housing in a different way, to look at a shift from arts housing to arts spaces. All right? Is there possibility to have spaces where it's not just about artists in their rooms, in their studios, doing their work, which is important, but are there also alternative spaces where the work that they do can engage the wider community? And two examples of these, one is Aliwal Arts Centre, and another one is Goodman Arts Centre, where the artists come together, hopefully they can engage with one another in these shared spaces, they can share facilities, and they do programs that reach out to the wider community as well. So that's the second possible model that we are looking at for arts housing. And the third one that's very important is really working in partnership with different agencies. And so this Community Sports Facility Scheme is very important, the CSFS. It creates opportunities really for arts groups to work with commercial partners. So in this case, the Singapore Dance Theatre, for example, its studios, its rehearsal spaces are actually in Bugis Plus. All right? We also have other examples like Very Special Arts. In Changi, we have a Wild Rice that's going into Funan Center. So more and more opportunities for arts groups to work with commercial players to unlock more of these spaces. All right? So that's presentation, that's arts housing, fairly straightforward. But I think the next part that's, I think, very, very crucial is what we talked about, the idea of activating public spaces. And I had a conversation with our moderator just now about the word activating and you know, what's the significance of that word. It's a word, all right? And we know, whether it's activating, it's energizing, but the idea here is looking at how spaces can be more than what they are now. Can they have multiple purposes, multiple dimensions to them? So can you have events there, programming there, events, pop-up events that really bring vibrancy to these spaces? So one example is the Civic District, and I think many of you may be very familiar with this area here. Lots of cultural assets within that location, wonderful place on the weekend to go to, and why not, you know, bring arts performances there, bring arts activities there. So URA has a wonderful initiative, Car Free Sunday, which really energizes that space, so it pedestrianizes that area, you can walk around. And so they work together with agencies such as Sports SG, the NAC, to really bring programming in there to, you know, really maximize the possibilities there, right? So another thing that the National Arts Council has been trying to do is to really work with artists to bring the arts to the public in a very visible way, and that's where visual arts, of course, comes in very nicely. So the idea then of the public art, we work with artists such as Tan Wee Lit, Han Sai Po, to bring very visible artworks into public spaces. I'm sure as you walk around Singapore now, you see a lot more street art. These are ways that you can make a space feel like there are people living there, working there, playing there. Really, it becomes a lived space, all right? A very active space. So another example I wanted to share, which is a program that we were really very pleased with, was a pop-up noise event. The noise movement is NAC's effort to engage young people in the arts, and we decided that we didn't want to just have another exhibition or another concert in the traditional spaces, and so we actually brought young artists into Chinatown, and the young artists interacted with the residents in Chinatown, the elderly residents there, and actually asked them to talk about their lives. And in doing so, to then create a series of music and art programs that were then site-specific within the Chinatown area, this is Kreta Ayer Square, and how we can then create intergenerational opportunities as well. Partnerships, very, very important. And so it's not just about working with public spaces, but also commercial spaces, as I had mentioned. So one possibility, of course, is to work in corporate spaces like malls, and this is an exhibition, a performance that was done at Ion Orchard. There's also opportunities to work in a more sustained way with corporate partners. And so this is one example, a real estate development company, Maple Tree, where we have worked with them over 4 years to reach out to about 6,000 people through a series of lunchtime performances by groups such as Nadi Singapura, Singapore Chinese Dance Theatre, Ting Yi, the Royal Dance Off, to have lunchtime performances so that if you're just walking by, you're just a member, of the working crowd, suddenly, hey, there's this burst of energy, this splash of the arts that is in an unexpected space. You didn't expect, during a lunch break, suddenly you see artists, performing in an open space like this. And that creates excitement, that creates a certain magic in our lives. I think is also very, very important. Another example, we worked with URA to unlock one of the areas within the rail corridor. I think you're very familiar, lots of people jogging along the rail corridor. And I think while URA continues to explore different possibilities for that space, one of the things that we thought would be exciting is the idea of bringing street art in. And so we worked with URA to develop a series of urban art events at night, literally underground, where young people could feel like, hey, this is a space where, it's free, we can go and do stuff. And so the idea is that street artists can go to this space and do what they want on the walls. It's not monitored, it's not policed in any way. And we have found that it's been wonderful. The street artists use that space responsibility. We've not had to paint over anything. Because I think when you work closely with the artist community, you give them that trust, you build that relationship, they can really make spaces come alive. So my very last slide that I wanted to highlight is that, of course, it's not just everything that the National Arts Council is doing. It's all about the artists and the arts groups, and many of them have wonderful ideas. I mean, Gaurav will be sharing with you later what SRT does with Shakespeare in the Park. And I just wanted to end off with this wonderful example by a theatre group, Drama Box, where they have the Gong Li, sorry, not Gong Li. You see, yeah, you can tell what era I grew up in, the Goli Moving Theatre. And this is a wonderful initiative of Drama Box where they go into public spaces to do these outdoor performances that really activate the community. So, they bring outdoor theatre, community theatre performances around. But other examples they have done outside Toa Payoh Square, and in fact, in other different spaces, a project called Both Sides Now. Puppetry performances, forum theatre, film exhibitions that deal with the issue of aging and living with dying. Another example they have is the recent project at Dakota Crescent. So the idea there of working with communities, not only to present the arts in community spaces, but also to use community spaces and the arts to comment about community spaces. All right? So in summary, basically it's this idea of how we need more spaces for artists to create and present their work. We hope for more opportunities for the public to experience the arts as part of everyday life, and the importance of partnerships between the artists, the NAC, but also with corporate and non-arts public agencies. Thank you very much.
I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just telling you about SRT for those of you who don't know, and then I'll spend about 5 minutes telling you about spaces that have been the tipping point of growth for us, and I'll finish by my wish of what I think is what's needed next. SRT, very quickly. We are we are one of the largest arts groups in the country. I think we're the largest theater company. We have a staff of 25. We employ approximately 300 people a year on a freelance basis. We produce 8 shows. When I started, and I have been there 22 years, there were 2 of us. And we would sit in a bar, and we would drink martinis, and we would decide what the next show was going to be. You have no idea how I miss those days. Now, we submit 3-year plans to the National Arts Council. It does not happen in a bar. It takes weeks and weeks to put this document together. NAC, I have to say, has been great over the years in terms of the paperwork needed is actually reduced, which is amazing for an institution. It's less about the paperwork. But it is a whole different landscape from what I started in 2 decades ago. But this is what I tell people. Whenever I meet a crowd or I meet a sponsor or I'm talking to audience, I am not selling you a theater ticket. I am selling you time. And then I will give you the theater ticket for free. That's what you're buying. That's why it's really important. So, where we've grown. One of the big shifts in the last 20 years for us is we produce all this work locally, but we've reached a point where we have to go international. We're not making money in Singapore. It's just not happening. We have to forge these international ties. But the other thing that's happened is next year SRT is 25 years old. And in the last 3 years, what I've tried very consciously to do is I actually think of ourselves as an education company now. We're not just a theater company. It is all, for me, about giving back. We are the big brother now. It's shocking to me when that realization dawned on me that we're not the new kids on the block anymore. When we realized that we are actually one of the largest institutions, non-profit theaters, it was how do we groom the next generation? And I'm going to come to that with space. But what we have done is we have created an entire learning and engagement department. That sounds so grand. We have 2 people in our learning engagement department. But my point being that what it tries to do now is a lot of our focus is on what we can do in schools, what we can do in community centers, how we can engage them with the theater. Every time we produce a play now, there is an entire pedagogical discussion about what can happen before, during, and after that performance. So it's not just about the play anymore. It's how do we make sure that young people know exactly what they're coming to see and how they can maximize that experience and what are the takeaways and work they can do in school or at home after that. That's become a core focus of what we do. And we're hiring people just to do that now. Very quickly, the main stage I think most of you are familiar with. We produce 3 to 4 shows a year. And I divide that up into, it could be a comedy, it could be a play, I call it the hot new work, something that's just won a Tony or Olivier Award. I will do a big musical at the Esplanade, our Shakespeare in the Park, which I'm going to get into in a bit. So I try and make it a varied season. That has pluses and minuses. If I did 3 musicals a year, we would make money. But because I'm trying to do something for a very broad audience, we in essence want to, okay, I'll come back to that. We then have the Little Company. The Little Company is probably one of our greatest achievements. 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we started doing theater for children. It was for 2 to 6-year-olds and 7 to 12-year-olds. And my biggest problem in town was there was some theater for kids, but it was very sporadic in quality. And we were bringing in some of the best designers and directors from around the world to work with Singaporeans on our adult shows. We decided we're going to do the same thing for kids. If I'm going to fly in the best set designer in the world to come and design the set for one of my adult shows, I made sure in the contract they designed the set for the kids' shows as well. That completely changed the landscape. And by doing those shows of that quality, and respecting that if you hook a child at the age of 2, they will be theatergoers or arts lovers for life. By going in with that philosophy, we really feel we've made a difference in transforming this landscape. Because those kids who were 10 years old 10 years ago are buying tickets for Shakespeare in the Park now, and we have proved that. I have a funny anecdote about that later, which I will tell you how that hasn't worked. But for the most part, it really does work. Stage 2 is for new incubated Singaporean work. The Young Company, so the Little Company is our investment in future audience. The Young Company is our training program for young actors and young writers, and that's our investment in future talent. Stage 2 is our investment in writing, and the main stage I have told you about. We do, skip this. We can go through that. You can see we have a very broad range of things. I do 7 shows a year. 3 are for kids, 3 are the main stage. We have our Shakespeare in the Park, and then we present one. So 7 of our shows are produced in-house. 1 I present from around the world. And that really is a piece of work that I feel I have found is so exciting that we have to bring it to Singapore. And the majority of those works that we have presented annually have happened with the Esplanade. And we would not have been able to do it without the Esplanade, which is also what I'll come into. I'll finish very quickly on the prelim part. I've told you about the 300 people we employ. We have grown from doing things. Is there anything that I need to stress? One of the key things that I think is really important is our residency program now. We give full-time employment to 1 or 2 residents a year for 1 year to come and work with us, either in production management, directing, stage management. As soon as they graduate, they can be with us for a year and get to work with a professional company. And the goal is that these young people are going to go out, and because I've brought in 7 amazing directors from around the world, or from Singapore, they get to work with 7 different directors in a year, which, where else do you get that opportunity? Like, I wish I had that when I was young. Okay, now, 3 game changers that have changed the landscape for us, and I think by extension for Singapore. The arts housing scheme that Kenneth was talking about allowed us to build, at that time, the KC Arts Center, DBS Arts Center, now the KC Arts Center. It's a 380-seat theater at Robertson Quay. The land we are able to lease at, as Kenneth said, at an 80% subsidy from the government, but we had to raise the money to build the facility ourselves. So we put in the $8 million, raised the $8 million to build that venue. That was a major tipping point for 3 reasons. It gave us a home and a branding. One of our biggest challenges was and to some extent I think it still exists, the audience would come and see shows in Singapore, but they had unless you were an absolute arts lover, Joe Public did not know whether it was an SRT show, a Wild Rice show, a TheatreWorks show. They went and saw a play, you could describe the play, but they wouldn't know which theater company did it. Having our own home made a huge difference. That was one. The second thing that it did that was really important is what I said about the little company. The kids' shows happened in the morning, and the adult shows happened in the evening. So having those amazing designers and directors I was telling you about, because they're working in the same space, and most theaters are empty during the day. So we do shows at 10 a.m. and at noon for the kids. We turn the set around and we do the adult show in the evening. So suddenly this venue is being utilized the entire day. And then on some occasions, not so much anymore, but on some occasions we do post-evening activities on weekends with music. What we were also able to do is we were able to give other arts groups subsidized rental. And we worked with a lot of other arts groups to say, hey, it goes a little to what was being said about the curation process. Because there was this entire thing in the audience about who's doing what, we decided, we're not going to fight it. Why don't we go and speak to other practitioners who do similar work? And if we can encourage them to be in our venue, then it's not so important whether the audience knows which theater company which does it. It's important that they know this type of, I get a lot of flack for being mainstream, but mainstream is not a dirty word for me. But mainstream work can happen in this venue. And audiences know that they're going to go and see shows with a beginning, middle, and an end. It doesn't have to be chronological, but there is a storyline in a lot of the work we do. It's not experimental necessarily. So I think this was the first thing that completely transformed. Giving us a home gave us stability. The second thing, there are only 3, this isn't going to take too long. The second thing, in 2002, the Esplanade opened. And in 2000, we started having a conversation with the Esplanade, where the Esplanade came to us and said, we would like you to do our opening musical. And now this was huge for us. I mean, that's a great honor. A Singapore company gets to be in the opening festival of the Esplanade. I was thrilled. I mean, I was very proud of that. By 2000, so the Esplanade opened in October 2002. In January 2002, the Esplanade started panicking. I had this conversation with Benson, where Benson was basically saying, are you sure you're going to be okay? I'm like, we're fine. It's going great. And he goes, you know, because it'll look really bad if we bankrupt one of our Singapore theater companies. That's not the point of the Esplanade. And I'm like, we'll be fine, we'll be fine. And I left that meeting thinking, God, I hope we're fine. Because nobody had produced work on that scale. We've done big musicals, but we'd never done anything in 2,000 seat for an extended period of time. How many of you saw Forbidden City? Yeah, a handful. Forbidden City was the game changer for us. We did it for 3 days in 2002 as part of the festival, knowing and collaborating with the Esplanade. The Esplanade commissioned it, that it would come back again in 2003. The part I forgot to tell you earlier is for my first 5 years at SRT, every single morning, I would go to work at 10 a.m., and between 10 a.m. and noon, all I did for the first 2 hours of every single day, 5 days a week for 2 years, was return the calls of creditors. Every single day, I would call and I would beg creditors to give us an extension because we would use the April show revenue to pay the March bills. And we'd use the July show revenue to pay the April bills. And in the event that, let's say, one of those shows didn't do well, suddenly we were asking creditors to wait 6 months instead of 3 months. And for 2 years, that's all I did. I called and I begged people to give us a chance. And they did. They really did. But it was heartbreaking because, you know, you could go to a big multinational and say, hey, give us a couple more months, and they're fine. But you go to your mom and shop printer who's done us a favor to print our programs, it's heartbreaking. But can I tell you that was probably one of the most character-shaping things I've done in my life. I learned a lot from that experience. So we would operate annually at a $500,000 deficit every year for about 10 years. The Esplanade changed that. Forbidden City allowed SRD to go from a $500,000 deficit to a $500,000 profit. The minute we had a $500,000 profit, everything changed. I changed the way we staffed, I changed the way we programmed, I made sure we had a reserve, I made sure from 2002 to today, not one single person has ever paid late. And it could not have happened until we had this venue. By doing a show for a 3-week period, we were finally able to make money on a show. And that's why I prefaced this entire conversation by, if I did 3 musicals in a year, we'd be golden. But where's the fun in that? Because why do 3 musicals in a year when you can kill yourself building a city outside in the park, in the sweltering heat, for an entire month, which guarantees that you're going to lose another $500,000 every year. We have done this for 10 years. This, outside of the little company, is the thing I am the most proud of. I love Shakespeare. Shakespeare changed my life. I hated Shakespeare in school. I went to school here. I have a teacher who I will not name who killed Shakespeare for me. It was not until I went to believe it or not, ironically, I went and saw a production of the Royal Shakespeare Company when I was young. That cemented my hatred of Shakespeare. But then I went to California, and I went to Shakespeare Santa Cruz, and I watched Shakespeare in the park. And we were sitting under these giant redwood trees, and the fog rolled in at the end of Macbeth, just as the soldiers were invading Burnham Wood, and it was just changed my life. And I'm like, I'm going to do that in Singapore. We're going to make sure every Singaporean has that experience, and I'm going to make sure people love Shakespeare. And we've done this every year for 10 years until last year. And every year we lose $300,000. And I persevere with it, and I have to say I am grateful because I have a phenomenal board who encourages us to do it and supports that deficit, because it's important. Because those young people, any people who come and see it, have a phenomenal time and we bring it to life. If it is done well, you do not need to understand every word. You want to have a great experience in the theater. And we build these huge operatic scale sets that are hard to find anywhere in the world, sets that are that big. But we sell out at 30,000 people and still lose ridiculous sums of money. And this year we decided to stop it because we just could not sustain that deficit. So we have at the moment our SOS campaign, Save Our Shakespeare. It's a crowdfunding campaign to bring it back because because I think it's important. We've got to do it. All right, that's it. Those are my three things. Having our own venue, the Esplanade, and the park are the three things that I think have been game changers for us in terms of physical space that allow us to do the kind of things we're going to try and do. I'll finish by telling you a funny little anecdote. When I started this talk, I talked about how our little company, those kids are now buying tickets for Shakespeare in the Park. Last year, that's not last year, the year before, there was this young woman who came up to me and said, Mr. Kripalani, I'm so glad you're doing Romeo and Juliet in the park. I'm so excited about that. That's wonderful. I went to see, I can't remember what it was. I went to see Midsummer Night's Dream. We were studying it in school. I went to see Midsummer Night's Dream and I completely understand the text and thank you for doing it. And I'm like, wonderful. Have you bought your ticket for Romeo and Juliet? And she's like, oh no, I'm not in school anymore. This, to finish, this is what I think is the next step for SRT. We've heard different speakers say different things. We need different spaces. We need, every arts group has their own journey to grow on. We have a lot of 200-seaters, we have a lot of black boxes, we have a lot of 400 to 600-seaters. We have this gorgeous 2,000-seat theater and concert hall, and that's complemented by the two MBS venues. For us, and I speak for SRT now, I'm not speaking about the entire industry. For us, the critical thing to build now is a 1,000-seat theater because that is financially where I think arts groups can become sustainable. In our 380-seat theater, the minute you do anything with beyond 5 actors, it will not make money. You need scale and you need time. So we've done our math, and basically that 900 to 1,200 seat venue is what is going to make us self-sustainable, that we don't have to go to the National Arts Council every year and say, please, please fund us. So that's my wish. Thank you so much.
So we've actually listened to success stories, right? I mean, from the very beginning, when we heard Michael talk about policies and then on to the Esplanade, NACs with its programs, and of course, this fantastic success story of SRT. So then I'm wondering, you know, what's there left? I mean, everything is good, right? Everything is put in place. You have the spaces for everyone. You have spaces for the community, you know, to enjoy arts and so on. So I was actually a bit, you know, I was scratching my head a bit. But we did, you know, during tea just now before the session began, I raised this question, and this is about, this is me putting on my anthropology hat. In arts, in wanting to know that, I mean, we can see that in each of all these experiences, it involves different stakeholders, right? Whether you're thinking in terms of government institutions, private bodies, the artists, as well as, you know, members of the public. So there are stakeholders. And I'm wondering, you know, in that regard, would it not be such a case that, you know, because, you know, you are a stakeholder, you define spaces in a way that you prioritize, yeah, or you give priority to what is at stake, right? And in so doing, in defining these spaces, does it not affect, yeah, accessibility? In the broadest term of the word, accessibility to that space. I know, I mean, like, you know, it sounds like a difficult question, but, you know, I mean, I think, you know, you guys, you know, were already thinking of it, right? So, does anyone wants to start?
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's why, towards the end of my presentation, I was very mindful to say that it's not just about what everything NAC is doing, because I think a lot of the artists and the arts groups are doing a lot of stuff from the ground up. And I think it's not just about the artists, it's about the public. So I think going forward, we do need to see how we can make sure that the spaces that we activate, we don't program it. I mean, I totally agree, curation is very important, but I'm sure you will agree as well that there needs to be an opportunity for the public, for the community, to be able to co-create how some of the programming that goes into these spaces, so they don't become locked into a specific use as determined by institutions or agencies. Yeah.
I think a very big stakeholder is the audience, actually. And if you look at where we are today, very small fraction, actually, of our population actually buy tickets. Many would come for free performances, but they may not necessarily fork out the money to buy a ticket. If I look at the traffic, for example, Esplanade has something like 8 million visitors a year, but only a tiny fraction of them actually buy tickets, because they come for all the free performances, they come for the F&B, they come, just to enjoy the aircon and the sight and the views. So I think but it's necessary. I think it's a step. The way I look at it is like it's a scaffolding. You must raise awareness, you must make people enjoy, and when they get used to the experience and they look for more, perhaps they'll be able to take that into their consumption patterns and how they spend their time and their money.
I think Suriani totally agree with you. And I think for those of you who don't know, Dr. Suriani is actually a very highly esteemed artist in her own right. She is a master potter, a protege of Iskandar, nonetheless. So do look out for her works, beautiful works. But I totally agree that there is a danger of over-programming in any context, and this is where sensitively we have to balance. And I cite a number of examples whereby, it's just the public coming up, reacting, contributing. I just came back from Hanoi on a personal visit. They've closed the whole area around Hoa Kim Lake in central Hanoi and major streets leading to it. Something that we in Singapore don't dare to do, but in Hanoi they've done it. It's not just one Sunday a month or something, it's every Saturday and Sunday. And people just go there, they activate the space, they perform, they walk, they sing, they dance. It's amazing. And this is supposed to be a communist country, whereby some expression is supposed to be limited. But it's just amazing. They're going there, they're using the space just through the closure of those roads every Saturday and Sunday. Fantastic. I also cite Ueno Park, whereby the Japanese come out and the kids come out, they perform, they dress up, etc. Happens every weekend. The people come up, the space is there. I cite Federation Square. It's a square. It's got a big screen. People like walking on it because they're picked up, they're filmed, and they appear on the screen. How many wedding proposals have been made on that screen? No, but these are the amazing spaces whereby they're not programmed. It's just natural humanistic tendency to come and activate the space. Can we, Singaporeans, can we have such spaces to activate? Will we activate? Dare we activate it? I think that's a critical question. And the other thing I'd like to say in terms of spaces is that I don't think we have enough spaces for makers and creators in Singapore. Makers and creators to exist to where they live, work, and play. Today, if you make or create, you go to this building, you live in this building, you work in this building. How about something which you can do all together in one space? Firstly, a young person starting out pay less rent. Instead of paying $2,000 for rental of a maker space and $2,000 for rental of a living space, push it together, save $2,000, make more. No, can that be done? I think there's a shortage of that. We see in Ghosts many years ago, the potter going pot, 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 right? And then the ghost behind. No such space in Singapore because you can't pot, you can't bake, and you can't live together. Why? Because if you bake, the electric oven is deemed as a fire hazard. It may go out in flames and burn the whole building down. So I was asked a question in New York City by a group of master students in a city planning class, and they asked me, where are the garages of Singapore? Where are your maker and creator spaces? So I ask you that, do we have it? And then I ask you a next question. Are you in the audience, particularly young people, going to be able to use that space? Do you want to be makers and creators? Or do you want to have regular employment and earn your salary to pay your housing loan? These are all questions that we have to consider.
No? Thanks, Michael. But you see that one point that you brought up just now about activating spaces. You know, actually, yeah, we had a chat also, Kenneth and I was like very intrigued by that term, activate. You know, because it seems like, you know, like you can switch on. You know, turn on that switch, and then you know it's sort of like whoa, you know, something grand will take place. But activating spaces requires collaboration, requires cooperation. So I'm just wondering, you know, in terms of you know your experiences, all your experiences in wanting to activate spaces. So what is the one challenge you know each of you have faced in you know towards you know getting your objective?
I think I did. I think I talked about that very clearly. I think the Fort Canning is a very good example of getting people to come. I mean, the parking is difficult. It's outdoors. It's Shakespeare. It's like, how are we going to get people to come? I learned a very good lesson when we did a show called Akong's Birthday Party, which once upon a time, it probably still is the longest running show Singapore's ever seen. We ran it for 6 months. I don't think any local play has run for 6 months. Basically, our entire advertising campaign when we started was come and have an amazing picnic with phenomenal food, and by the way, we'll do a Shakespeare play for you.
I think the NAC has been very encouraged because over the last few years when we've done our studies, we see the percentage of Singaporeans attending the arts, participating in the arts is going up. And we're like, yeah, Singaporeans now believe in the value of the arts, yay. And then they did the survey where they said, you know, what's important to you, what are your priorities? And it's like, no, I'm not in the top few, no, I'm not in the bottom few. And I'm like, really, arts and culture is right at the end of what is important to you. And I thought that was a very instructive for us, which is that many people appreciate the arts, they value the arts, but it's not a priority for them. It's not seen as a necessity. And so when there's something that prevents you, whether it's just laziness or it's hot or you know, any barrier, you instinctively go, maybe not. There was a study, and I always remember this, not in Singapore, but they asked people, would you donate money to keep a museum going? And lots of people on the street were like, no, we wouldn't, you know. But then you ask the question, do you think the government should keep a national museum going? Everyone will say yes. So the idea of the arts and culture as a public good, everyone values it, but is it a priority? Is it something that you're going to commit yourself to? And I think that links to your idea of audience as well, right? Because we talked about how if you don't have to pay tickets for free shows, there's actually very good turnout. But once you put in that price, once you put in some sort of barrier, we need to make sure that we have inculcated that value of the arts, that it makes people want to get over that hump.
Yeah, I think there's a particular narrative at work here, which is, I think Michael alluded to it, which is that, you know, we have the pragmatic narrative, right? Which is that, you know, we have to look after our sort of economy first, and then after that, then we can afford the arts and culture. So that sort of brackets arts and culture as a luxury good, you know, and it's something that actually you only when you can afford it. But actually, if you go back, I mean, before it became a top-down, with sort of NAC preoccupation. I mean, are we really saying that in Singapore we had no arts and culture? It's not true, right? Because we had our own theatre, we had our own music. It just wasn't organized by the government. It was organized by your clan associations, and organized by your communities, and so on. But then we seem to have sort of given it, as Kenneth has, we've abrogated that and given it back to the government and said, this was now for the government to do. I think we should take it back. I think it's really it's part of our own lifestyle and identity. You know, it's not something which is imposed on us.
That's why I really wish to promote the idea of naturally occurring and community grounds up reaction to all this. The space is there, program it. Because if we activate space the way we officially activate the space, as Gaurav has said, it costs money. I mean, the night festival team is here, and when we activated Bras Basah Park, we had to pay $180,000 to put up the fences, to divert the buses, to employ Cisco guards to control the traffic. That was before we even programmed anything. We had to pay money to close down, create the space. So similar issue as Gaurav. There is a cost factor. And I think that's always the critical factor, the cost. So where are the spaces that we can naturally have things happening? Federation Square is a great space. It really naturally occurs.
So you see, then, is it just, I mean, it's clear, it's not just about space alone, right? I mean, it's not saying that, okay, we do have already quite a lot. And in fact, we were talking over tea just now that, we don't need to have more. I mean, we can try and make do, yeah, with what we have. So it's not just about spaces. Then is it about ways of thinking and ideas, yeah, about the arts? I mean, you were talking about that just now in terms of audience ways of thinking, and also in terms of ways of thinking about artists at work in a gig economy. So, is it more than spaces? If so, what then?
So maybe it's not just thinking, but it's also habits and behavior and hobbies and practices. So the more I think that, and I think there's so many opportunities now, right, for particularly growing up in Singapore, there's so many things that you can take up as a hobby. The challenge, that they say, is always when you leave school or so on, it changes your life. You stop playing sports and you stop following your hobbies because you have to worry about making a living and so on. But actually that's not true, right? You should be able to follow still some of your interests. And I think these are the habits that you take over into your life that will actually sustain you and actually make you feel at one with others who follow the same hobbies and habits, because then you form a club, your neighborhood may have common interest groups and so on.
I'm actually hugely optimistic because of what is going to happen. We had what I call the lost decade. There was a decade where it was decided that literature is not important anymore. And schools no longer had to teach literature if they didn't want to. And for all of you who are slightly older in this audience, we all had to do some literature in school, like it or not, but at least you had an exposure. We went through a period where it was decided literature doesn't guarantee an A, so it doesn't have to be taught. And that decade of those students who are now adults, that's going to be, and those are the people in the workforce now, that is going to be our black hole. Big time, in terms of exactly what you were just talking about, in making it, inculcating this into something that we just take as we have to go to the arts. It's important. That thinking has changed, literature's back, the whole mindset. I think where I'm optimistic is in my little world, in my little example, I look at the kids who come to the little company and the parents who bring their 2 to 6 year olds to come and watch a show and come and see all 3 shows a year, plus all the other kids shows that other theater companies are doing. And they see it as important that their kids get exposure. Those kids are going to be the next generation, so I'm very optimistic.
I like that optimism, but you see, I mean, you were also the one who gave the story about a student. They're not in the school anymore. I mean, you don't go to shows because they're no longer in school. You go to museums, you go to performances because it's part of the school program. So where does it take us? It takes us, to me, I think in that sense, it's about that competing ideas. It's about competing priorities, right? In terms that that all of us. I'm not saying, I mean, I think all of us, will have to grapple with, right? I mean, those of us who believe that, art is important.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. My name is Yu Tam from CLC. My question is I would like to see your comment on how do you see the Singapore's arts scene going forward in the context of smart nation? So I know it's a very, very broad question, so maybe I can give you some info on where I'm coming from. So I'm coming from the perspective of education because within the context of smart nation, you see huge amount of investment being poured into science and tech in R&D, and it has also have major implication in school curriculum. So you see courses such as computing, coding, programming, modeling, all these being added to the school curriculum, especially in the lower level, like primary school, secondary school. So it's not just the knowledge and skills that's been transferred to a student, but also it affects the perspective of students of how they look at problems and analyze problems. So I'm not saying that these two, smart nation and arts, they are necessarily conflicting objectives, but it will somehow have an impact on the art scene. So I would like to just seek some opinions from the panel. Thank you.
Okay, so some of you may know I also chair the Singapore University of Technology and Design, which is about as geeky as you can get. But I can tell you the kids have got some of the best creativity you can imagine. We have two Steinways. We have some very good pianists and musicians. We have organized joint concerts. In fact, I think we have a monthly concert. Recently, we did one with the Yong Siu To school from NUS, and we're trying to do something with. So I don't think the two are necessarily conflicting. I think there will be increasing use of technology in things like entertainment, clearly. And we should not look down our nose at entertainment and say it's not art, because I think entertainment feeds artists. Okay, it's one of the ways in which artists can keep themselves fed and clothed and so on. So I think the use of technology itself is going to enable new fields and new explorations. But I think you alluded to something which is more to do with the education system and the fact that there are perhaps limited time for curriculum and so on, and so choices have to be made. I think it's certainly possible that in a limited curriculum, more time for one subject means less time for another. But it doesn't mean that all schools will be the same. And I think the direction, as I understand it now, is that schools will have increasing diversity and will be able to choose the areas in which they want to be good at. And whether they're good in that area will determine what kind of students, what kind of parents send their kids to those schools. I don't fear technology. I think it is something that is going to make our lives extremely interesting, and if anything, is going to raise more questions about issues of social justice and I talked about the gig economy and so on, right? It's going to raise a lot of issues around how do we handle the social science, the sociological impacts when you have disruptive technology coming in. And that's a very fertile field, I think, for artists.
Just three very quick points. I think the first one is to say that I think definitely in terms of art making, whether it's digital art or, I remember very distinctly Necessary Stage did this performance where they brought in social media into, I think it was called Poor Thing. So I think for the artist community, there's lots of possibility, but I don't think that's something we want to dictate. I mean, it's really for artists to use the technology available to them. But I think the other one that's very interesting about Smart City is really the opportunity then for arts companies to use the technology to better understand audiences. How you market, how you reach out to audiences, how you excite audiences, engage audiences, understand, behaviors of the audiences, etc. So I think that's the other advantage that technology can bring to artists. The third thing about education, as a former literature teacher, I was outed by someone just now. I totally agree with everything Gaurav says. Do you know that actually in Singapore we're very lucky that we have art, music, and literature compulsory subjects up to the age of 14? That does not happen in every education system around the world. For me, the important thing is the quality of that experience, because I think we know it may not be the best experience. But we do have a structure that protects the arts. Totally agree with Mr. Lee. MOE is, paying more and more attention to the idea of diversity of schools, holistic education, and just as you have technology coding, etc., being integrated into school life for students, the arts are becoming more and more integrated in school life as well. 30% of students are in an arts CCA. I mean, that's incredible. And we talked about how art and music is compulsory. And one of the things that we have worked with many artists on is actually bringing the arts and experiential learning into the teaching of math and science and history and languages. And there's a movement for that as well, the whole idea of teaching through the arts, integrated arts. So I'm also very optimistic.
I think smart technologies and digital technologies, etc., have really opened up a whole new spectrum for artists and performers. I remember seeing a theatre show that because of technology, it enabled the performance to be held in 2 different cities, and performers in Singapore were performing, and the performers somewhere else in the world were reacting, and they were both screened together. So I think it's really amazing that technology has enabled so many people. Justin Bieber would not be Justin Bieber without YouTube, for example. People embrace technology. Avicii, Kygo, they're all DJs, but because of technology, they've become successful performing artists. They use technology to create the music. There's no need for a 5-piece band, 8-piece band anymore. Artists are using Photoshop like mad. You can be beautiful anytime because Photoshop just makes scenery even more enhanced. And technology will change art. And with the advent of 3D printing, 3D sculptures, etc., I think we're just geared for a whole new form of artistic expression.
Hi, my name is Fiona. And my question is about maybe spaces that are less successful in terms of certain indicators, which are also maybe important. I'm very fond of Gilman Barracks, and that is not in the central, the cluster. It's a quieter space, it's a visual art space. I think it's also challenging because it's not as sustainable. So what is the future for spaces like this, which are quieter, they don't have that buzz, that energy, but it is important also to appreciate the arts. And it doesn't seem to be economically maybe viable. It's less traffic, but those who know it really appreciate it and have a different pace of living the arts. So how does a space like that then survive?
Okay, I suspect
I
it's
just go
going
to
to be me
that
a lot
screen
today.
place there.
Okay, well, I prefer not to talk about individual specific space. So I think to take your question more broadly, I think you're very right in the sense that we need different indicators for different spaces. We shouldn't say that the success of Gilman Barracks is the same as the success of our Tampines Hub or the Esplanade. It is just completely different. And I think what I can say is from the National Arts Council's point of view, we're very clear that Gilman Barracks serves a specific role that's different from another art space in Singapore. And one of the things that you talked about, which I think is very important, is that it's in a different part of Singapore. It's not in the civic district, it's not in the BBB district. And that creates another outlet. And I think that's something that we are trying to look at. So one of the things that we are doing is working with the People's Association, for example, I've got a colleague from PA there, to develop community nodes so that you have art spaces all around Singapore and they're not just clustered in one area. So again, it's back to the idea of the arts being integrated into everyday life and all parts of Singapore. So that's kind of like the broad answer. So I mean, basically, yes, I totally agree with you. You need different indicators, definitions of success for different venues, but definitely, Gilman Barracks is a success in its own way, I would say.
Well, I would differ in that point of view because I do think Gilman Barracks has not succeeded as it was meant to be. Gilman Barracks was supposed to be our response to Qi Shanghai. Shanghai? Beijing? Yeah, that's Beijing. Sorry, wrong city. Shanghai is its own version. But Qi Beijing is actually a disused factory area, and it naturally happened. The owners didn't want to develop, so they allowed artists to set up, galleries set up, etc. So it naturally grew into a huge tourist draw, the number 1 tourist attraction in the whole of Beijing and perhaps China as well. So so Gilman was set up as a reaction, but Gilman was activated. So we set it up. It was not naturally occurring, and hence maybe there was a shortfall there. But to me, I think what would help Gilman is that we make it true to what it should be. We should provide infill artist studios, the creator spaces in between the gallery spaces. So infill it. There's plenty of land, and it's so difficult to walk in Gilman because it's so far apart, right? So infill. create the artist studios, create the potting studios, create the workshops, the sculpture workshops. Make it a real, authentic, living, breathing makers, creators, and gallery area. That would be my suggestion. My other suggestion, actually, is do we really, and that was the beginning of the debate, whether we should actually create Gilman Barracks. How about activating the area around Singapore Art Museum instead? Plenty of old buildings. 333 Queen Street is available, but we lease it out for 3+3. Waterloo HDB complex, plenty of galleries, plenty of empty spaces. Could HDB not carve out spaces for makers and creators? Then we have a city makers creators district and the Singapore Art Museum spearheading this, showcasing the work. So that is a secondary idea, creating a city-based makers creators district. And then Waterloo Street, you already did it so beautifully. It was supposed to be for weekend, free market, etc. Does it happen? It doesn't. Because everybody is waiting for the Tsinghu to organize it. No, but in Paris, in other cities of the world, people come out, they paint, etc. So why not? What is stopping us? It's there. Can this be our own art space at BBB as well?
I just want to turn it the other way around, Michael, and saying that, yeah, I mean, those are good suggestions. I think that, it's something that, who knows, might work. But in that process of again, of wanting to activate or energize, or what is the word that is used? Okay, yeah. Are we seeing to the needs, the needs of the artists, of the, and then you can add on the audiences themselves. Are we tending to the specific needs of varying forms of art and art making?
I think to some extent I think definitely we can do better. But it goes back to something I think Michael said about even for Gilman, where Gilman was intended to be something. I mean, I had the privilege of actually just going to see Siopa 2 weeks ago. I think Siopa is a wonderful space. I think if Gilman could be that, it'd be fantastic. But again, I think when it comes to spaces and their purposes, they can evolve and they can change. And while I agree with you that Gilman may not be what it was envisioned to be, perhaps it could be something else. And maybe I agree with you, maker spaces are very important. Doesn't mean it has to be at Gilman, it could be somewhere else, and you alluded to other spaces as well. So I think what I would say is that there's so much diversity and sophistication and maturity in our art scene today. It's a real challenge to be able to cater to every arts group, and you talked about that as well. Every arts group is on a different journey and a different needs and expectations. And so I think that's going to be the struggle for us. And I suppose it goes back to our earlier point that perhaps it shouldn't be the government keep trying to find spaces, unlock spaces, activate spaces. It needs to be a partnership with everybody, with commercial partners, with non-arts government agencies as well. And artists, I mean, some of the arts groups have told us, I don't need your space, I can find spaces on my own, and off they go and find, wonderful spaces. I mean, I know an arts group that moved from Goodman Art Centre to a space they found in Yishun, and they rehearse there, they work there, and they're happy there. So I think it's about relooking at different possibilities, yeah.
I just saw the card put up, and that we are almost close to the end of the session. I want to invite each and every one of the panelists, maybe to to give your last remarks and maybe ideas. I mean, in terms of perhaps a reflection, a reflection of what you've done and how you might have done it differently.
Who would like to start?
She gave you the mic. Yeah.
He's just convenient.
How would I do it differently? So, on one hand, I'm incredibly optimistic. On the other hand, being the non-profit arts group at this panel, the reality of Singapore is it's shockingly expensive. And making this living is incredibly hard, and the arts is not going to survive without funding, whether it's government or corporate or philanthropic. It is not a commercial enterprise and will not be at the way Singapore operates at the moment. And I do a lot of these talks, and I try very hard to stay away from the, oh, we need more money. But really, we need more money.
I've said a lot. I'll just end by saying that, hello, hi. No, well, what I was going to say was that you have inspired me, and so if I could change one thing, I would have joined the Arts Council. I've continued as a literature teacher.
And if you had been my literature teacher, then I would have had a whole different outlook on Shakespeare.
So why don't we tackle the issue head on, which is why can't we create jobs in the arts and creative industry? I think during the RCP time there was a big push in this area. I think it didn't materialize for all sorts of reasons. But I think if there are good jobs in the creative industries, then it will draw people in and it will draw funding. And I think the illusion is that the good jobs are all the artists' jobs. Actually, artists' jobs are terrible jobs. The good jobs are actually, the production managers and the presenters.
You tell them. This one job, a production manager. Where's Ling? Oh, Ling's snuck out. A production manager makes a shocking amount of money compared to anybody else in the arts.
If you're a really skilled sound and lights guy, you can make a lot of money. Okay, we still look at Marina Bay Sands. They're still employing expatriate. Sound and lights people. So there's plenty of jobs in this area. And if you look at curation, I mean, how does an artist get appreciated? It's because there's somebody who bothers to understand the artist and presents him in the best light to the potential audience. I think curation, I mean, if I was born again, I want to be a curator.
Well, I take it as a more macro view as a planner. In London, you have the Museum Mile, and people make it a point to go to the museums on the weekend and visit the Museum Mile. In Singapore, the museums and National Gallery, even with free entry, are not teeming with people. We are not ready to have cultural destinations. So that's where perhaps I think there may be a flaw in the plan. When I go to see the Art Science Museum, people are happily shopping in the mall, then suddenly they see a banner and they say, okay, I will spend $25 to enter the Art Science Museum. I tell them it's stupid because our museums are free. But yet they spend $20 to $25 on the ticket. Why? Because along the way, they're going for outing, they're going shopping, and hey, there's a museum show, maybe I'll go in. They didn't have to make that conscious choice to go to a museum. So if I had to do things again, I would actually morph Orchard Road around this area. So you have shopping, you have hotels, you have residential, you have museums. It's all part of daily living. It is no longer a destination.
So there you go. I mean, you've heard all of them speak, presented their ideas and also, strategies and how things, how they would like to do things differently. Join me, everyone, to thank all our speakers.